Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Museum Moment. My name is Molly Dubin, and I'm the curator for the Jewish Museum Milwaukee. And I am thrilled to have with us today a very special guest, Doug Stapleton. He is the Associate Curator of Art for the Illinois State Museum. And the Illinois State Museum is where the vast number of pieces that we have borrowed for our current exhibit, Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? Jewish Artists of the WPA are on loan from. So we thought it would be incredibly fitting to ask Doug to talk to us a little bit about the collection, the relationship to the WPA, and maybe highlight some artists and some stories so that we can learn a little bit more about this incredible collection. So welcome, Doug.
Thank you, Molly. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's an honor to be able to talk to you about this topic and something that I've come to know a lot better over the last few years myself, and find it just vastly, endlessly exciting and interesting. So to talk about the Illinois State Museum and its relationship to the WPA, the first slide here, just to tell you a little bit about the museum. It was founded in 1877. And was one of the oldest state museums in the country. The collection started in the early 19th century and kind of moved back and forth. It was a natural history collection originally. But by the time of the late 1920s and early 30s, during the time of the Great Depression, the museum was well established. We had a new art section, a new art program that was established in the late 1920s. And it was housed in this building on the right, which is the Centennial Building in Springfield. We now have a newish facility that was opened in 1963, but this gives you context of where the museum was in the 1930s. So our involvement, the museum's involvement with the WPA started late. The museum became involved with programming in 1938. You have to remember the WPA had been active in Illinois, mostly in Chicago, starting in 1933. But in 1938, the Illinois State Museum formed a liaison with the Museum Extension Program of the Works Progress Administration. And it was primarily set up to sponsor, to assist other public collections with exhibitions, regional museums, historic sites with cataloging their collections and doing interpretation. It was really a program that was meant to sort of bolster museums around the state. And it's kind of the birth of the modern day museum, the way we understand it, with education and outreach and all of that. In May of 1940, the museum opened what was called the Modern Youth Museum. And it was located in this building here in downtown, this house, historic house in downtown Springfield. And the Modern Youth Museum was for children, hence its name. And this is a handwritten report that was presented to whoever the higher ups were about the state museum's involvement with this extension program. And you can see the photo on the right are these children inside the house looking at a display. And what they created were original exhibits, like dioramas of historic events and places. They created dolls, hundreds and hundreds of dolls, dressed mostly of children, dressed as in historic costume or of famous people. And they also created like little miniature models of airplanes, trains, essentially talking about like technological history. And the person who's responsible is this wonderful woman, Dr. Harriet Smith. She was the state supervisor for the Illinois Museum's extension program, and she was Illinois' first field archaeologist who conducted some groundbreaking work at Cahokia Mounds Complex. So this is an
Fascinating.
honor. Yeah, this is an honor.
She has a little bit of a Rosie the Riveter look.
I know, doesn't she? Yeah, she is just kind of great. I mean, that's just it, this whole thing. And she's the one who hand wrote that report. So these exhibits that were created by this extension program, and here are, somebody making a coach, making airplanes, making dioramas. These were for the Youth Museum in Springfield, but they would be sent to Chicago, to the Chicago shop, the WPA, to be duplicated to turn into traveling exhibitions, which were then sent to rural schools and communities around Illinois. So this really was an extensive kind of traveling exhibition program. And of course, for us, for the museum at this point, it was really a reciprocal arrangement because the museum had 12 employees at the time. And with the inclusion or this liaison with the WPA, with the museum extension, we brought an additional 35 people. So that more than tripled our staff. And these were paid workers who were like the woman on the left who was preparing specimens for the herbarium, the woman on the right working with the paleontology collection, essentially trying to, like, by best museum practices at the time period, trying to get things up to snuff. And there were over 6,000 botanical and geological specimens that were collected and cataloged during this time period. So it was a real boon for our museum. And here's other images of Russell Cummins preparing a bird skin. And here is a group of people working on these dolls that I was talking about. And one of the stories about these dolls, and here's an example of 3 of them from the Children of Yesterday, a Springfield resident named Monty Lee Zimmerman. And she worked for the WPA extension program from 1938 to 1941. She was paid $20 a week. And in the course of learning to make these dolls, she mastered modeling in clay, doing plaster molds, cast wax techniques, created all the costumes, all the props, all the paraphernalia for these dolls. And they were 10 inches tall and were put on display, at this Children's Youth Museum.
They're incredible.
Oh,
Wow.
there are, and we have some of the collection. We didn't get a chance to really pull them out to photograph them, but this was from that report mentioned earlier.
They're wonderful.
Itself is like an amazing document, which I had not seen before. So one of the legacies of this was after the program is closed, I think through 1941 or so. So we had all this material from this children's museum to these traveling exhibitions. So in 1948, our museum director established this museum mobile, which was the first traveling museum mobile in the country.
That is fantastic.
Isn't that great? I wish we still had that.
I do too.
So that was our traveling education program, which was kind of an extension of what happened during this museum extension program with the WPA. So the art section, they benefited us in other ways as well too. We have a collection of over 500 pieces, and how they came to us was through traveling exhibitions, for one thing. So during the life of the Federal Art Project, the national level, they organized traveling exhibitions. And we hosted several of them from 1940 to 1942. But it was actually in 1943, towards the end of the Federal Art Project, that an allocation unit was set up in Chicago to essentially disperse what they called movable, undistributed artworks. Because primarily artists who were enrolled would submit work, which would then be dispersed to like schools and libraries and institutions around the country, around the state, and anything that was left over would have been dispersed to, example, like the State Museum. So we received a big portion in 1943, but then in 1967, Mr. and Mrs. Lewis Cheskin donated a substantial group of sculptures, several of which are in the exhibit that you have in Milwaukee. And then in 1983, the Illinois State Library, which also received an allocation in the 40s, transferred all their prints to us. So that's why we have this fairly large, extensive WPA collection.
And it truly is extraordinary. That was one of the most challenging things, was honing down the selections, because there's so much to choose from.
I kept pulling, look at this one, what about this one? And I, as you know, I just had a WPA show in Chicago from the selection. So I had been going through it as well. And, I just spent days going through the drawers of prints, which is just a wonderful treat. I'd love everybody to be able to do that.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to just talk a little bit about some of these individual stories of artists. That's just they're a bit anecdotal, but they kind of talk about, well, one of the main things I think that what was a real benefit for this Federal Art Project was for women artists. At the time period in the late 20s and 30s, exhibition opportunities in Chicago, I'm sure Milwaukee, other places were minimal. And it was still primarily a white male-dominated industry, if you could even call it an industry at that point. I mean, And for women artists, you either had to be well connected or fluent or have some other connection through marriage or through sponsorship or whatever, perhaps to have an independent career. And I think with the Federal Art Project, it allowed women artists especially to independently on their own to have to step forward into the role of a professional artist. So artists received anywhere from like $25 a week onward upwards, uh, and they were required to produce one artwork per month. Um, and to sort of register or put in a certain number of hours. And they could, with the federal art projects, since it wasn't tied to like doing a mural or something related to a building, they could do it at home in their own studio, or they could have access, like you say, to the print workshops. You talked about prints earlier in one of your programs, or to one of the other workshops that were available to them to make work. Um, so it afforded artists some flexibility of time and also gave them the resources financially to really hone their skills and develop their own artistic style. And this was had a great impact, especially on some women artists. This is Bernice Berkman that you have the piece in there as well too. I'll come back and talk to her in a moment. And but actually, what I wanted to show you, this next slide, this is the back side of that, which a lot of people don't see, but I think
Right.
it's fascinating. All the different labels. We have our museum label, but there's a, identification card when it was probably turned in, and it says craft shop, and then here it says designer. So I suspect that those may have been done maybe as models or designs for later mural that maybe have
Ah,
not been produced, because they were those. That's just what gives me that indication. But it was allocated to the recreation center in Lewistown, Illinois, which is in the center, in the middle of nowhere here. I shouldn't say that because we have a museum site there, but sorry, people of Lewistown. I'm sure it's a lovely town. Gertrude Abercrombie. So she's an artist that's not in your exhibition, but I wanted to talk about her for a moment. She enrolled in 1935, and she, in later life, we had an exhibition of her work, and she had been interviewed, and there was been a lot of research done about her. She talked about the association with the WPA, with the Federal Art Project, as the beginning of her life as an artist and as an independent adult. It allowed her to work full time, uh, um, unobstructed as a visual artist, and she was paid a substantial amount of $94 a month, which was a
wow.
fortune for the time, to produce an easel painting once a month. And she worked from 1935 to 1940 for the program. But the thing that's really important about Abercrombie was it offered her the opportunity to move out of her parents' house at the age of 26. And her parents were strict Christian scientists. And we know historically that there was not a lot of, there's a lot of tension between what her parents wanted for her and what she wanted for herself. She moved into the Weinstein apartment buildings, which was in in the south side of Chicago, Hyde Park neighborhood. Um, and this was a painting she did of a recollection of that apartment from 1945. And it was really where she stepped into her own. She stepped into um, not only her role as an artist, but also this is where she made lifelong friendships, including Milwaukee's own Carl Creeby,
Mm,
the artist who's a lifelong friend of hers, the artist Charles Seabury, the writers Thornton Wilder and James Purdy, and the
wow.
musicians Sonny Rollins and Dizzy Gillespie, who are also lifelong friends of hers. And this independent,
Quite a circle of friends.
it was a huge circle of friends. She had, I mean, she's a fascinating character because she had these Saturday night, Sunday salons at her house that were jazz musicians
Mm,
coming through town. It's a whole nother story. Um, but one of the things that happened at this time in 1935, in the early 30s, when she enrolled into the program and sort of had this independence, was that through Thornton Wilder, she had met Gertrude Stein, who had come to the University of
mhm.
Chicago to give a lecture. And according to Gertrude Abercrombie, she had a conversation and received a sort of impromptu critique from Gertrude Stein, who had said to her, quote, "They are very pretty, but girl, you got to draw better." That's what she said.
Okay.
Apparently, Gertrude Abercrombie went back to her studio and created this painting there on the table. which is really the beginning of her mature style, and which she submitted to the Chicago and Vicinity Show and won a $100 prize. So it was her first big recognition. And that came from having the ability, the freedom to be an independent artist under the Federal Art Project. Julia Tekla, another Chicago artist, a very quiet, almost kind of, uh, um, all these women had this persona, public persona about them. Abercrombie sort of presented as a witch. She actually really loved that kind of austere uh, uh, presentation, public presentation. And Julia Tekla was actually a much shyer, retiring person who was almost had kept like pet bunnies and wore these cute little like cowboy outfits, and probably would have just been swallowed up on her own in an art world that was, but through the Federal Art Project, which she again enrolled in, she was able to have the security to create this really sort of lovely private vision. And her other main involvement was within the dance world of Chicago. She was friends with choreographers and dancers in Chicago, created set designs and costumes. And for her, it was a sphere of creativity and identity for women. And she painted it many times. And this little bunny is actually her stand-in, her visiting her friend Mary backstage in this lovely little gouache painting. And then Messina Barton, who came to Chicago from Michigan, who was a very, very outspoken and very forthright artist, or forward-thinking artist, who created this really wonderful sort of like still life tableau for the WPA from that WPA collection. But what she's probably most famous for is her nudes. Again, this is the 1930s, and her there was an art critic, Bolliet, C.J. Bolliet, who actually was her lover for about 20 some years, who claims that she was probably the first American woman to do a nude self-portrait. This is 1935. I think Alice Neal actually has that.
I think that may be right. Yeah.
Now, but at the time in 1935, Bolliet thought she was. This is one of those nudes that's from our collection on the left. Many of them are actually quite striking. And here's a photograph of some of her other nudes on the right. And, you know, I think she was a exemplary student, but when she joined the ranks of the Federal Art Project and really kind of got that recommendation or that allowance to sort of step into her own, she really seized it. But it's also just indicative of what was going on at this time period for women artists, is Bolliet, the critic, you know, praised her work, but referred to her work in terms as blunt, outspoken, primitive, barbaric. These are the words he used to describe her work. And he meant it as a compliment, but it really belies his own prejudice about how women artists should behave in public.
Yeah.
But Barton had to, what she had to counter and say about it was, and this is a quote from her, is she took her own counsel. She said, "Art is a personal expression. I paint exactly what I feel, and I'm not influenced by the methods of other artists, even those whom I admire the most. I paint to please myself." And I think she really did. She looks like a very formidable person, I think.
Agreed.
And I love to compare, you know, Barton's painting with the Brynon painting that's in the exhibition that you have, because here's like these two competing visions, you know, of the American scene, social realism, you know, the bounty of the Midwest or the desolate Dust Bowl, you know, scene of dead trees from 1937. I think it's just a great kind of comparison.
Really captures the complexity and the
I mean, the idea of,
yeah,
the American scene was trying to make these uplifting images, but there was still this reality. And it's a question of, I think Brynon was a social realist and a social critic. I think Barton, though she was very independent, was a bit more maybe conservative and not involved with politics and that sort of social thinking. So one of the things that came out of this, and I'm going to sort of wrap this up here soon, is the this women artist salon of Chicago from 37 to 53. So this was a group of women who sort of banded together to create like an exhibition opportunities for themselves. They sort of self-selected and organized and selected who was going to exhibit with them. The first and these are mostly younger women like Tekla on the left, Messina Barton, this is one of her self-portraits, or Fritzi Broad on the right, who were kind of this new generation of young women artists that did not come from affluent backgrounds, who essentially worked their way through college, and also were demanding kind of to be seen as independent artists and have access to higher education and access to exhibitions and a viable income. So this was really kind of a new woman artist that was emerging at this time period. And many of them were members of the Federal Art Project. And I'm taking some of this information from Joanna Gardner Huget's research. She's a DePaul University art historian who's done incredible amount of research on this work. And so I'm stealing and paraphrasing like from her like crazy, and I apologize to Joanna. But actually I want to go back to this one a little bit too as well too, because this early collective, this Women Artists Salon, they would have a yearly exhibition, and it really was about practicality. They were not a radical group. What it really was born out of desire for financial and artistic independence and financial success. So they would say they were a bit of a little bit more conservative in their outlook, but of the first exhibit, 36 women exhibited, and 15 of them were enrolled in the Federal Art Project, including Tekla and Barton and Broad. And Tekla was actually a member of was one of the officers. So go back to Berkman, because here, again, this may be the radical versus conservative kind of bumping heads a little bit. Berkman, who was a sort of social realist and a bit of a social radical as well too, was scheduled to take part in the 4th annual Salon of this Chicago Women's Salon, and she pulled her work because Julia Tekla, the secretary, had asked her to uninvite her Black guests who were to come to the reception because she thought it might cause concern for the North Shore Chicago patrons. These guests were Berkman's future husband, Oscar Hunter, who was a critic and writer, the painter Bernard Goss, and the artist Charles White, who just had that huge retrospective at the Art Institute. But Berkman and Hunter went on in 1949 to start their own wallpaper company called Burke Hunter. So that's just like, I think some of that legacy, that moving on after the Federal Art Project, especially where women artists were like, we want these opportunities for ourselves and we're going to organize to make them happen. So the legacy is, I think there's so many things you could say about where we are now in relationship to this time period. But here is like some statistics about just the Federal Art Project alone in Illinois, the number of murals and sculptures and easel paintings, and nearly 800 artists who were employed during that time period. It was a phenomenal effort on the part to ask artists to step into the role of social commentator, a bit of maybe a social cheerleader, cultural cheerleader, to really to be a part of society, to have an impact, a visual, a graphic, a literary, a music, a theatrical impact at a time when people were, because they really thought it as a democratic way of bringing culture as a way to bring people together. And I think, we still have remnants of that. We struggle with that. We fight against it. We see it all the time. And exactly. And I'm actually ready for another WPA to happen, Federal Art Project to happen all over again. So,
you're not alone. You're not alone.
So there is a little brief journey. Molly, cheers.
Cheers. I'll raise my coffee there. Doug, I want to thank you. This has been incredible. And of course, it's just kind of the tip of the proverbial iceberg in terms of the collection. But I love that you focused on some specific stories and some of the specific, philosophies in terms of the social realist artists and the issues of the day that were important to them. And particularly the focus on women who, as you aptly said, there really weren't a lot of opportunities. So, the fact that there were a number of women who were able to, have careers or contribute as part of federally funded art programs is something that is very, very exciting and important to highlight, and why I made some of the selections from your collection that I did.
Yeah, and like I say, like Harriet Smith, the archaeologist who was, one of the directors, Increase Robinson, who was part of the Chicago office for one of the administrators. Women also had important administrative roles in this program as well too, and they're all voices that are too easily sort of overlooked or forgotten. So I think the opportunities to raise them, to continue to raise them, are really, really important.
Very well said. And with that, we're going to wrap up our museum moment. Thank you to Doug. If you've not had a chance to come in and see our exhibit, please do. And I encourage you to visit the Illinois State Museum. Has some extraordinary collections and exhibitions, and something that is definitely on the to-do list. So thank you. And a shout out to Robin Cohen. Thank you for making today's museum moment possible. And we'll look forward to seeing everyone soon. Take care.